Weird noises. He must be having a bad dream or something. While Suimai was groaning in his sleep with a grim expression, the three troubled girls watched over him. Suimai, of course, was rather relieved when he did eventually wake up. A sermon at the dojo? One day, after finishing his kenjutsu practice, Yakagi Suimai was taking a break on the veranda of the Kushiba residence. The sun had already set and a refreshing night breeze was blowing against his face. While lazily sitting on the edge of the wooden veranda in his gi, he found himself with the folding fan he had in his breast pocket and gazed at the moon that had gotten big on the horizon. It was around then that a voice called out to him from further down the veranda. Suimai. His gaze was naturally drawn towards the source of the voice that tinkled like a silver bell, and when he looked, he spotted his childhood friend, Kuchiba Hatsumi. She'd been wearing the same gi he was before, but now she'd changed into comfortable-looking sweats. So this is where you were? Yup, right here. I finished up, so I was just taking a little break. After loafing a bit more here, I'll go on home. At that, Hatsumi looked and sounded somewhat dissatisfied. It's not like I came here to tell you to leave. Really, the opposite. It'd be problematic if you just left on your own. Why is that? Mom said she's making dinner for 5, that means you included. That's. Sorry about being a bother all the time. Nobody thinks of you as a bother. Truth be told, we'd rather you not be so reserved and come over more often. You're not eating proper dinners, are you? It's not like I'm. Hatsumi eyed him, looking half self-satisfied and half exasperated. Suimai started to deny her claim, but I bet it's instant noodles. Ugh. Microwave dinners, mostly curry. Canned mackerel with just salt on it. I could keep going. Do you have anything to say for yourself? When she gave him an unrelenting scowl, Suimai capitulated. Raising both hands above his head, he admitted his neglect for his own health. Sorry, my bad. I was lying. See? You don't eat properly on your own after all. It's not always like that, you know? When it's time to eat, I do so properly. I wonder about that. Suimai tried to smooth things over in a fluster, but Hatsumi remained prickly. It was plain as day that she didn't believe him. But she let it go there. She sat down next to Suimai and changed the subject. Suimai, about your training. What about it? You know what? I'm telling you to take it seriously. So that's what it was. Suimai gave her a bitter smile. However, he had a proper defense on that point. I am taking it seriously, you know? Even when it comes to the practicing swings and forms, I'm not holding anything back, you hear? That's true, but can you really say you're taking your training seriously when you only come to the dojo 2 or 3 times a week? Lately, we're lucky if you come by once. I thought I told you that I have things to care of. I've been busy. Things to take care of? Is it really something that takes up that much time? That's precisely why I haven't been showing up. Regarding that, Instructor Kiyoshiro already knows what's going on. So what are these things? Even when I ask, you never tell me. It's a secret. That again. Won't you just tell me already? One day, that's all you ever say. With that, Hatsumi puffed out her cheeks in a pout. Normally she was quite serious, but every once in a while, a more childish side would shine through. Suimai thought she might be a little old for that, but because it was so cute, he hesitated in pointing that out. As such thoughts were going through his head, Hatsumi spoke up again in a somewhat disappointed tone with her eyes cast downward. At this rate, Suimai, you'll be left behind, you know. Everyone who joined in the beginning has gotten stronger, and even the newer children have been improving. Yeah, maybe. No, it's not a maybe. Even though you've been here all along, you're the only one who still hasn't reached the intermediate level. It was exactly as she said. When Hatsumi's father, Kiyoshiro, set up a dojo in the neighborhood. Hatsumi and Suimai were his first 2 students. Other children joined on afterward, and as time passed, each and every one of the other students surpassed Suimai with a sword. Of course, if he abandoned the fundamentals of the Kushiba school and fought like a magician as he usually did, Suimai likely wouldn't lose in a sword fight with any of the other students. Apart from Kiyoshiro and Hatsumi, he could easily see through the moves of the others and counter them. But since he couldn't use his magic in a normal fight, he didn't have much to show in the way of results when it came to matches. Suimai now primarily came to the dojo so that he would never forget the basics of the blade. But if he went too far in his training, he would be drawn in by the way of the sword. Both his father, Kazumitsu, and his uncle Kiyoshiro had explained to him in detail that a magician shouldn't become completely absorbed by the sword. So in that respect, when he thought about it, Hatsumi was right. He wasn't taking his training seriously. She had seen through him. Suimai. It's not good for the first student to remain weak, right? It sets a bad example for the others. It's fine as long as you're strong, right? You're really the first student. I'm the daughter of the dojo's master. That hardly counts. It didn't seem like Hatsumi was about to change her mind anytime soon. Suimai weakly knit his brow. Back then, you used to complain about me being strong. But now you're complaining about me being weak. Which is it, really? Isn't it obvious that it's better if you're strong? Huh? Nothing. Suimai couldn't hear her quiet voice. He asked her about it, but she firmly planted her feet on the ground, stood up, and marched off down the veranda. Watching her go, Suimai slumped his shoulders. Instructor, isn't it about time that we tell Hatsumi and Heistu the truth? His unheard, idle complaint was directed at Kiyoshiro, who was likely having a quiet drink in the living room. The magic in this other world is too far behind. Volume 5. Log. That memory. Dragons, you say? On that fateful evening, modern magician Yakagi Suimai heard the name of those infamous beings for the first time from the mouth of his father, Yakagi Kazumitsu. Dragons, in the contemporary world of fiction and fantasy novels, they were creatures commonly understood to have reptilian bodies, wings on their backs, and the ability to breathe fire. Eastern dragons were considered a symbol of virtue, while in the West, they were terrible beings of destruction akin to the devil. They were malignancy incarnate. An evil opposed by God and all the angels. Their reptilian nature came from what many consider to be the original monster, the snake. In biblical lore, it was a serpent that tempted Adam and Eve. Back in ancient times, religions of the book came into conflict with the indigenous religions of Egypt, which revered and worshipped snakes. Ever after, the serpent was seen in the eyes of Western religion as a symbol of evil, if not outright the devil himself. Dragons were a manifestation of that, and universally reviled as an enemy of both good and mankind. Needless to say, Suimai was quite surprised to hear his father casually ask out of nowhere, "Do you know about dragons?" Suimai had heard of them, certainly, but he was nowhere near as knowledgeable as his father. After confirming he'd heard him correctly, Suimai shook his head as he sat on the couch to encourage his father to explain. Evidence of dragons has been left behind in history books and literature from all around the world, but their actual existence is not recognized. It is something that we magicians conceal. Conceal? In other words. Suimai frowned at his father, stopping mid-sentence. Kazumitsu, meanwhile, tapped the armrest of his wheelchair with his index finger to prompt Suimai to figure out the rest for himself. They really do exist, right? Though it's all old history now. Like usual, his father was gazing out the window at the cloudy sky as he spoke. Suimai waited to hear what he would say next, but it wasn't quite what he expected. "Suimai, make some coffee," Kazumitsu said, turning to his son. Right in the middle of this talk. I suddenly wanted some. Now help an old man out. It's a parent's privilege to have your children make coffee for you every now and then. What kind of privilege is that? Is it fine if it's instant? I don't mind, but... Black, right? Got it. Are you also having some? With milk and sugar. Get used to drinking it black already. All in due time. Sweemai flashed a small smile at his father, whose expression hadn't changed at all. His father's face was always stony, though it wasn't for lack of emotion, he'd simply lost the ability to express it outwardly. It was evident from his words that he still had a good sense of humor and knew how to joke around light-heartedly, though only anyone close to him would ever be able to tell. So, what's this about dragons? You said magicians are hiding their existence, right? That's right. The fewer who know about them, the better. That was the idea, but things have changed. After pausing there to take a sip of his coffee, Kazumitsu continued, the Akashic Seer indicates that a dragon will appear in Europe. It will be a mystical calamity on a scale larger than any known to history. The Akashic Seer was a vessel used by the Thousand Knights Association to predict phenomena around the world. It could foresee anything from the inconsequential to the cataclysmic. In simple terms, it was an instrument for seeing the future. Though its true nature was more complex than that. A mystical calamity on a scale larger than any known to history. It's a vague way of describing it, isn't it? But the scale is the important part, it's only a matter of time before it's known to all magicians. So at this point, keeping it hidden is rather pointless. Because the last survivors of the dragons were wiped out 30 years ago, dragons will not ever be born into this world again. Then how is it that one is going to appear? The answer to that is Twilight Syndrome. An unexpected outbreak of instability at a certain location in Spain will become an A-grade disturbance on a grand scale. From there, a beast will manifest, and the prediction is that it will likely take the form of a dragon. A beast. A beast, short for a beast of the apocalypse. It was a manifestation of Twilight Syndrome. An apparition. Sweemai still wasn't clear on all the details, but he knew that they were entities that appeared to accelerate the world towards its end by annihilating all living beings. They were concepts that took the form of monsters in order to bring about the apocalypse. Most of them manifested as C-grade beings that were something like a mix of a dog and wolf. In the much rarer case that an A-grade being appeared, it would naturally manifest in the form of something deeply feared by all. In Europe, it was easy to imagine one taking the form of what was considered to be the ultimate evil, a dragon. But if that gets out into the world, there would be tremendous casualties in Europe. No, it probably wouldn't just stop there. A calamity the likes of which the world had never known. And on top of that, it would take the form of a dragon. It would take nothing short of a hero of legend to defeat it. But alas, the modern world was without a St. George or St. Sylvester to come to its aid. If they made a blunder in dealing with it, it very well may spell the end of the world. Then you must have, Sweemai said, looking at his father. Indeed. I was called for the gathering. This time around, 20 magicians were chosen to take part in the dragon subjugation, and an elite few are going in to defeat it. Who's leading the operation? The Thousand Knights Association. The group is unified under the eldest daughter of the Catlia family, representative of the enforcers of the Thousand Knights Association, Formelcress. Aiding her will be her younger sister, Zielkes. The two strongest enforcers in history are leading, on paper. In truth, the duty of leading all the magicians on site will be left to someone else. Though those two girls will be extremely helpful in the battle against the dragon. Kazumitsu quietly trailed off at the end. He'd mentioned the Catlia sisters, who were the current powerhouses of the Thousand Knights Association's enforcement agency. They both used magicka that manipulated time, and were said to have strength unequaled in battle. But because they were still only in their early 20s, even if they were given charge of the operation, they would end up handing over command to the more experienced magicians on site. For Sweemai, who was still as lowly ranked as a mere philosopher, this entire conversation was simply in another dimension. A dragon, the best of the enforcement agency. It's all quite an amazing story. I've been to Europe plenty of times, but it still feels so far away. No. You can't think of this like it's not your problem too. Confused at the meaning behind his father's words, Suimai raised a befuddled eyebrow. Huh? What do you mean by? In the prediction, the Akashic Seer revealed several possibilities, including the outbreak of a dragon, Europe's destruction, countless deaths, and the world ultimately racing towards the apocalypse. Naturally, because those are only possibilities, that means it's possible to prevent them. After skirting the heart of the matter, Suimai's father finally revealed why he'd started this conversation. And in order to do that, the final piece of guidance given to us by the vessel was you, Suimai. You are to be brought along without fail. Suimai stared blankly into his father's keen eyes, then, after a long moment's pause, let out a shrill yelp. Me? That's right. The actual reason for that has not been made clear yet, but it likely means that your power will become the key to fighting the dragon. Yakagi Kazumitsu spoke of this most serious matter with his usual stoic, unchanging expression. Nevertheless, though it was just a flash, Suimai was able to catch a glimpse of the proud emotions welling up inside him. His son's power would be integral in the battle to come. He was happy about that, but as expected, all of this was a bolt out of the blue for Suimai. To be honest, I can't help but think I'll be completely useless. As a magician, I'm pretty low ranking. You simply have not been bestowed a proper rank yet. I'm certain that I've trained you to be capable. You're also confident in your own abilities, are you not? I can fight as a magician, for sure. I followed along with all your battles, after all. You've even taught me about dealing with mystical calamities and such. But when it comes to fighting alongside high-ranking magicians, I'm still anxious. Suimai's voice quietly trailed off at the end. Really, it was perfectly natural for him to feel pressure under such circumstances. Regardless of whether they were foes or allies, there was a magic law known as rank disparity extinction that came into play when low-ranking and high-ranking magicians shared the battlefield. Low-ranking magicka would always be shut down by high-ranking magicka. Effectively, it was made extinct within the domain of a high-ranking magician. Such a phenomenon, however, would not occur unless there was a particularly remarkable discrepancy between the ranks of the magickas involved. And because the conditions for it to occur were so specific, it generally wasn't anything to be worried about. But knowing that he would be in a group with some of the most powerful magicians there were, it would inevitably be an issue. If they made concessions for Suimai and purposefully kept from using high-ranking magicka so as not to trigger rank disparity extinction, it would be a serious problem. They would be facing a dragon, after all. Everyone involved would need to give it everything they had. Certainly the high-ranking magicians present shouldn't waste their time worrying about a low-ranking magician like Suimai. It would be one thing if he could use support magicka where there would be no risk of triggering rank disparity extinction, but Suimai didn't think the support magicka he could use would even be of any help to high-ranking magicians of this caliber, so it wasn't like he could just smile, nod, and agree to going. Kazumitsu shut his eyes and sighed before answering Suimai's anxieties. The reason you're doubting yourself right now might be the fault of how I raised you. Kiyoshiro has told me I'm quite guilty in that regard. What do you mean? Frankly speaking, it means I've been overly strict. Short of the truly spectacular, I've never really praised you, have I? Well, no, not really. Kazumitsu had taught Suimai magic himself. But even when Suimai had shown remarkable potential and progress, Kazumitsu never offered much in the way of praise. That was fact. But Suimai had never thought much of it, and had simply chalked it up to his father's taciturn disposition. Which was why he didn't understand what his father was getting at now. Suimai. You can use large-scale magicka, can't you? Huh? Yes, of course. You were the one that told me any self-respecting modern magician had to be able to use at least one large-scale spell. Although, taking into account the chanting speed, it would be rather difficult to use in actual battles. In order to keep up with his father's training, Suimai had worked out a few such spells. Following along with his father's intense battles, he'd even developed them to the point he could use them recently. But putting that into practice in actual combat was a completely different story. For the fight in Spain, the number of magicians who'll have the ability to use large-scale magicka independently without a major ritual will total 5 at most, both you and I included. So other than those 2 from the enforcement agency, there aren't all that many strong magicians coming. Even though we're talking a beast that could destroy all of Europe? Ah, no, that's not what I meant. Humph, to think that my faults as a teacher would be so glaring after all this time. Suimai generally felt like he understood his father fairly well, despite his inscrutable demeanor. But right now, he felt like nothing short of a mystery, but the simple fact that Suimai was so stumped as to what Kazumitsu really meant only highlighted the problem further. Currently, even compared to other high-ranking magicians, Suimai was more than equipped enough to join the fight against the dragon. However, since Kazumitsu had always hated the idea of Suimai becoming a magician filled with self-conceit, he'd been especially hard on him as his teacher. Kazumitsu had never properly explained to Suimai that he was following in the footsteps of an exceptionally skilled magician. In short, that he was being held to a near-impossible standard. Suimai's father had originally wanted him to live a normal life. Like a normal boy, completely ignorant to the world of magicka. But once he crossed that line, his father took his training very seriously. Perhaps too seriously. And that was now the source of Suimai's confusion. He thought all of that had been normal. But nevertheless, he had gained great strength from it. Kazumitsu was proud of him, both as his father and as a magician. Any of the magicka organizations would have gladly welcomed someone of Suimai's talent. The only problem was that Suimai had no idea. It could be said that Kazumitsu had gone too far in trying to quash all self-conceit in his blossoming magician of a son. Nearly the opposite had grown in its place. Suimai was now victim to a critical lack of self-awareness. How exactly that would affect him in the future would be up to him to handle. But for now, "You'll understand everything if you go," said Kazumitsu. "That being said, don't lose your focus. This battle will likely be the greatest challenge you ever face." "Yes, sir." Suimai nodded to his father, and after the 2 of them were finished with their coffee, he stood up and took their mugs to the sink. As he stared at the water rushing out of the faucet, he realized a sense of discomfort was washing over him. A dragon, huh? He could feel an ominous tingling on the back of his neck like it was being singed. It grew into a burning, pulsating sensation as it assailed him. From what his father had told him, it was a power that he'd inherited from his mother. Though Suimai had no way of knowing what it meant at the time. It could be said this was the day magician Yakagi Suimai's battle truly started. Chapter 1: The Dragon Ute in the Moonlight. The utter stillness of the darkwood forest was like a barrier that prevented any and all from entering. But amidst it erupted a thunderous roar, a cacophony of whipping winds, and a light so bright that it would burn one's eyes just to look at it. Right after Suimai and Hatsumi defeated Demon General Vashta, the dragon Ute Inru had appeared suddenly and fired off a dragon's roar. It was the source of the disturbance, and in its wake, the trees of the forest were reduced to ash. All that was left were smoldering fires here and there. The scene was completely unrecognizable from mere moments ago, and the fiery blast undulated under the night sky like red waves of dawn. The only 2 things left standing were Suimai and Hatsumi. Everything else had been blown away by the power of the dragon's roar. Even the ruins of the hero summoning ritual that Suimai had been looking for were incinerated without a trace. Both of their gazes fell on Inru, who stood above the flames. By looks, he appeared to be a young man. Perhaps even an intellectual. He had a slender, elegant figure and stylish bangs falling down onto his shoulders. He could have easily been mistaken for an aristocrat who knew nothing of the ways of battle, but in truth, he held enough power in one hand to blow away a group of demons, and his feet were firmly planted on the spot like the roots of a great, ancient tree. His strength and fighting spirit belied his appearance. He simply radiated power, exerting an intimidating pressure on everything around him. Hatsumi held her sword aimed at his head as the dancing flames licked at her golden hair. Without relenting a single ounce of her vigilant guard, she sharpened her green eyes like a blade and questioned Inru. You expect me to come with you? That's right. I cannot reveal the reason yet, but I need your power. I'm sorry to inform you the power of a single girl like me doesn't amount to much. That might be true if we were talking about your strength alone. However, you have another power within you, no? It sounded like he was implying the divine blessing bestowed upon the hero. But just what did he need a hero's power for? Based on how things went just now, said Hatsumi, it doesn't look like you need it in order to defeat the demons, right? Naturally. Those guys are completely secondary. If all goes according to plan, they're fated to disappear soon enough anyway. Inru spoke fearlessly. Though he claimed to need the power of a hero, it seemed his goal had nothing to do with why the heroes had been summoned in the first place. Frankly speaking, you're just too suspicious, said Hatsumi. What's with threatening to take me with you regardless of whether or not I consent? Because to us, it's necessary. Don't you think it's normal to build up trust beforehand? I never had any delusions about sweet talking you into coming with me. Don't misunderstand, I have no intentions of treating you politely. I don't particularly care whether you consent or not. So you're going to kidnap me? What exactly do you intend on doing with me? I told you that I cannot reveal the details. But, really, it's nothing much. We have a use for you, and we plan on doing exactly that, using you. TCH, treating people like they're objects. Listening to Inru talk, a sneer crept across Hatsumi's face. Anyone would have their feathers ruffled by being so blatantly told that they would be used. Meanwhile, Suimai, who was standing in front of Hatsumi to protect her, looked directly at Inru with his piercing red eyes and cut into their conversation. Aren't you supposed to keep the shady stuff to yourself and at least try saying something to get her to come along with you of her own free will? Isn't that the established tactic? Indeed, you have a point there, but the fact of the matter is that we will use the hero one way or another. I have no intention of leading you to believe otherwise. Ballsy. Despite plainly announcing that he wouldn't reveal his motivations, Inru was surprisingly frank about his intentions. Suimai wrinkled his brow at this somehow incongruous conversation. Though before that, you come first, Inru said, turning towards Suimai as if the hero were merely a secondary objective. Man in black, I would like to hear your name. Mine. That's right. The name of the man who splendidly defended against my roar. I simply must know it. Inru's unwavering eyes gleamed like emeralds as they looked right at Suimai. Is that so? Asking an opponent's name is a courtesy reserved for the strong. Don't tell me you plan on giving me a boring answer like, I have no name worth giving. As he implied that such a reply would be an utter disappointment, Inru unleashed a raging torrent of fighting spirit. However, as a magician, Suimai was well accustomed to proper etiquette before a fight, and since he had no reason to refuse, Suimai introduced himself. Magician of the Society, Yakagi Suimai. Though I guess you guys would say Suimai Yakagi? For some reason, Inru's eyebrow twitched when he heard those words. Did you just say Suimai Yakagi? Ah, yeah? Baffled by Inru's reaction, Suimai was wondering what was wrong with his name. Inru, on the other hand, suddenly dispelled the overwhelming aura of power radiating from his body. I see. So you were the one who did in Romian. What? I believe I owe you both a thank you and an apology. To do so while postured for battle would be inappropriate. It didn't seem like there was an ounce of fighting spirit left in Inru as he spoke. But that wasn't what had caught Suimai's attention. I'm sorry, I may have misheard you, but did you just say Romian? That's right. The elf Romian. The one who served as a librarian in the Imperial University Library. I mean exactly the man you're thinking of. Inru confirmed Suimai's bewildered suspicion. Hatsumi was completely lost as to what they were talking about, but even Suimai, who'd known Romian, had no idea what Inru was getting at. A thank you and an apology. About that guy? The incident that Romian caused in the Empire. I heard you were the one that handled it. So for putting a decisive end to the depravity of a fellow member of the organization I belong to, I would like to thank you on everyone's behalf. And then, with a light bow of his head reminiscent of a nod, we are in your debt. In other words, that guy was one of your companions? That's right. He's a comrade aiming for the same ideals as the rest of us. Or rather, he was. He already considered his camaraderie with Romian a thing of the past. But hearing mention of Romian's name at all, Suimai's distrust towards Inru only grew stronger. Suimai knew that Romian had honest desires before he was touched by darkness, but I don't really get it, but if that's how you feel, you should have kept a much tighter hold on his leash. There's no nice way to put it. That guy was beyond saving, you know? You're precisely right. I can't say anything in our defense. His will? No. Our failure to see that he had been taken in by the darkness was sheer oversight on our part. Based on the way you're talking, that uproar wasn't your real goal, was it? By and large, it is exactly as you say. Though, naturally, I mean the harm that befell that young girl rather than what happened in the city. In other words, the incidents in the Empire were something from the way he spoke, it was they stood to gain from. It sounded like what had happened to everyone but Liliana and Rogue was. It seems I may have said too much. I wouldn't mind if you kept going, honestly. I'll have to refrain. Your intuition is too keen. Even in the midst of panicking, you are still shrewd. Inru directed a sharp gaze at Suimai as he spoke. It seemed he'd completely seen through Suimai. But then Inru sighed and shook his head as though lamenting something regrettable. We were originally going to dispose of Romian ourselves. However, before we could make our move, you ended up defeating him. We cannot even pay you back. Those words came across as a mere excuse after all this time, but with the way he sighed, it truly did sound like he was ashamed and embarrassed at his own shortcomings. But there was something else that had piqued Suimai's interest. I get what you're saying about what happened with Romian, but how do you know that I defeated him? There shouldn't have been anybody present observing us at the library that night. Let's simply say our ability to gather information is just that good. They were bold words. But, just as he said, there was clearly no mistaking the strength of their intelligence network. Suimai knew better than anyone else there was hardly any evidence of what had happened that night at the library. Having heard enough, however, Suimai lightly shrugged his shoulders as he spoke up once more. Well, if you're so grateful for what I did, could you maybe just step aside? I refuse. Not only is there the hero to retrieve, but now I've taken an interest in you too. In the power you hold that overwhelmed Romian after he fell into darkness. Ugh, come on. Give me a break already. Inru turned a ferocious grin on Suimai like a predator that had found its prey. Just like Graziella, or perhaps even more so than her, he was the type who found enjoyment in battle. A dragon. A battle maniac. He was Suimai's least favorite kind of person to deal with, right behind lunatics. Seeing Suimai grimace like he was biting down on something bitter, Inru narrowed his eyes and curiously observed him. I don't really understand, but what has you so frightened? If you hold that much power, then there should be no reason for such cowardice. How strange. Mind your own business. I've got my own baggage to deal with. Is that so? Very well. Either way, it's about time we begin. Now, how will you do this? I don't mind if you both come at me together, you know. So it's a totally foregone conclusion that we're going to fight? Based on our little talk, it's clear that the young hero has no intention of quietly coming along with me. That being the case, is it not evident that I must now take her along by force? There's no need to make such a grim face. If you don't like it, then all you have to do is win against me. It's as simple as that. Inru gave a rather matter-of-fact reply to Suimai's scowling, and then once more fearlessly unleashed his fighting spirit. Even though the whole ordeal centered on her, the exchange between Suimai and Inru had completely left Hatsumi behind. All she could do was hold on to the anger in her heart the same way she did the blade in her hand, which she kept aimed at the new enemy standing before her. That enemy was the dragon newt named Inru. He'd quite plainly demanded that she come with him, though he wouldn't say why, and the aftermath had devolved into a fight. But the one bearing the full brunt of this man's fighting spirit was Suimai. He'd broken out into a cold sweat the moment Inru showed up. He looked like he was suddenly confronted with someone he'd never wanted to see again. He hadn't shown a single sign of anxiousness in their fight with Vashta, but Hatsumi could see it dominating his heart now. His index and middle fingers were restlessly rubbing against each other as he fixedly kept his gaze on Inru. "Yakagi, I'll take the front," she said from behind him. If they couldn't avoid battle, she thought their strategy should stay the same. She would leave support to him on the rear line while she acted as the vanguard. It was a solid plan for a mage and swordsman duo. However, Suimai seemed to think otherwise. "No. Not this time. Step back," he said sharply without so much as turning to look at her. "What are you saying? Aren't you acting like this exactly because he's an intimidating opponent? So wouldn't it be better to fight together?" "Hey, Yakagi. Yeah, he's an intimidating opponent, all right. The kind that dredges up the worst possible memories for me." After practically shouting in his ear out of irritation, she realized something from Suimai's trembling voice. He wasn't rubbing his fingers together out of restlessness. No, it was out of pure fear. "Are you that scared?" "Yeah, I am. You see, it was a dragon back then too." "Wait, do you mean when your father—" "That's right. We won that day, so I didn't think I'd ever have to go through this again, but I was naive. And just at the thought that I might lose someone else, I can't stop shaking." The reason Suimai was sweating and quaking in fear wasn't because he was faced with a strong opponent. It was because he was faced with a deep-seated fear of loss. Rather than fearing defeat, he was afraid of what that defeat would cost him. But Hatsumi thought that was all the more reason for them to fight together. And as she was silently conveying that thought to him. "No, it's fine. Leave this one to me. This guy is different from that demon. He's on a completely different level. If you still had your memories, it would be one thing. But if you can't pull all of the Kuchiba techniques and Da'ani out from the depths of your mind, this guy will be far too much for you to handle. But even so, I only fought against those demons earlier, but you've been fighting all day, haven't you? There was the incident at the fortress, and you had to defend yourself the whole time you were retreating. So even if you think you're fine, your concentration is worn out." "That's not true," is what she was going to say, but Suimai cut her off. "That's my line. Now, seriously, how long has it been since you've taken your eyes off him?" It wasn't until he said that Hatsumi realized it herself. She'd been completely focused on their conversation. If Inru made a move while they were talking, she would have been slow to react. She might have even fallen to the first blow of the fight. And the simple fact that she couldn't properly keep her guard up anymore told her that Suimai was right. Biting her lip, she relented. Without saying anything more, Suimai stepped forward. He looked like a knight in shining armor ready to protect her. She had more to say, but the words would hardly leave her mouth. As soon as she went to speak, her lips unconsciously shut tightly. It was the sight of the boy in front of her that had stolen her voice. That manly figure shielding her from the fight looked just like what she'd seen so many times in her dreams. He was just much, much smaller than. But even so, he'd always looked manly to her. That hadn't changed. Indeed, this was just like her dreams, the memories she would recall while she was sleeping. He was always stepping forward to protect her from an incoming threat. This was the same boy she'd aspired to be like. He'd smiled so gently at her when he stood up to that dog. It was a small act of kindness, but a priceless one in her eyes. And thinking back on it, she recalled something important. "I hated being the one who always needed protecting. Isn't that why I became stronger?" Yuck. At the sudden pain in her head, her knees buckled. There was a noise like a clap of thunder in her mind, and the next thing she heard was the sound of her knees hitting the ground. Perhaps suddenly recalling part of her memories had put a strain on her mind and body. But the question that had caused the shock in the first place had vanished into the ether. The next thing she knew, Suimai was talking to her. "Hatsumi? What's wrong? Are you all right?" "Why, yeah, it's nothing." "Then get back. I'm begging you." His pleading voice, though quiet, weighed heavily on her. It wasn't his words that were particularly compelling, but rather the desperate tone of his voice. Against that, she couldn't argue. Silently nodding back to him, Hatsumi drew back. As she did, Suimai finally looked a little relieved. And after she got a fair distance away, he turned his attention back towards Inru. "You sure waited for us patiently. It wouldn't be interesting to take you out with a surprise attack after all this build-up, would it? To thoroughly enjoy a fight, it's only proper to wait for it to begin fairly." "Yeah, I don't get you at all. Despite having a mission you seemed so intent on, you're just completely neglecting it. No matter what battles a warrior may be forced to face, the fighting itself must be done in a warrior's own style, no matter the cost. Is that not the case for you?" Inru spoke in a dignified tone, but Suimai kept up his provoking attitude. Magicians always try and catch their opponents off guard. Testing each other out is one thing, but in a fight to the death, there ain't no such thing as fair and square. So attacking an unguarded enemy is your style, is it? Certainly, that is similar to those mages who are unable to fight head-on. However, is that something you should be revealing before a fight? Chew on it. Be wary of any and everything coming from me. As Suimai went from quaking in his boots to baring his fangs, strange things began happening. Perhaps as evidence of the extreme instability of physical laws here, the air around him crackled with flashes of blue light here and there. Debris and soot floated up into the air and vanished as arcs of electricity bounced between them, and then everything started shaking. Hatsumi instinctively crouched to the ground like she would have during a severe earthquake. But standing tall amidst all the chaos was Suimai. Archaious overload. Without being drowned out by the thunderous shaking, a chant with a mysterious echo to it rang in the air. Mere moments later, a rush of mana burst forth from Suimai's body. A powerful shockwave followed, as though there had been an actual explosion. Hatsumi stabbed the tip of her sword in the ground and used it to support herself as she endured the blast. From her squinting eyes, she could see Suimai leap into the sky. Perhaps he was using magic that allowed him to fly, because he seemed to be able to freely control his movements in the air. After stabilizing himself like he'd flapped his imaginary wings in the wind a few times, from what Hatsumi could see, he came to a stop. Seeing all this too, Inru smiled, apparently amused at such an interesting technique. Even with his opponent claiming air superiority over him, he still seemed to have plenty of composure. Any ordinary combatant would have been at a considerable disadvantage under such circumstances, but just as Suimai had said, Inru was on a completely different level. Common sense didn't apply here. What excellent mana! The last time my heart throbbed so much was back against the man-eating evil. Inru smirked, and then, as if the two of them had arranged it beforehand, they both called out to each other. "Here I go. Come." As Inru and Suimai's voices overlapped, the curtain raised on their battle. The first thing Hatsumi really saw was that Suimai completely defied her expectations. Based on the way they'd fought together earlier, she assumed he would try and keep his distance and make this a long-range firefight. It would be the safest, smartest thing for a mage. But it was hardly the strategy Suimai chose. Though he could have easily targeted Inru from the air with magic, he closed in on Inru before firing a single spell. He was throwing away every advantage he had. Despite having more combat experience than him, she couldn't understand what was going through his head. It looked like he was just randomly zipping through the air this way and that. He would even sporadically land, but then immediately leap into the air again and do it all over. He would change course suddenly midair, fluttering briefly in place before tearing off in a different direction with no rhyme or reason. It was like he was trying to bewilder his opponent. Meanwhile, Inru was conducting himself with aplomb. At this rate, he could be attacked from any direction at any time. Knowing that, he kept on his toes. Every time Suimai entered one of his blind spots, he would immediately dodge accordingly. On top of that, Suimai was hammering him with low-powered magic to try and keep him in place, but it seemed to have no effect. Even when he took it head-on, there was hardly even a change in his expression. And then there were his counterattacks. Waiting for Suimai, who was constantly firing short-range magic and drawing nearer, Inru would leap for him the moment he landed. He moved with all the sharpness of a bird of prey diving on its target. He would come in from above like a flash of green lightning, only regaining human form right before he was about to strike. It was like he was some kind of storm god. This exchange repeated many times, and finally, the green bolt looked like it was just about to catch Suimai. TCH. As Suimai clicked his tongue, he snapped his fingers. The air in front of the approaching bolt exploded, but the bolt passed right through it unfettered. Before Inru's far too speedy attack, Suimai had no time to spin any words together. And without even a protective spell to shield him, Suimai took Inru's open palm completely defenseless. Just as expected, its destructive power was tremendous. Suimai, like a pinball launched by a spring-loaded plunger, was sent flying all the way to the distant line of trees that Inru's opening roar hadn't devastated. Watching all this unfold, Hatsumi audibly gasped. If Suimai didn't land properly, it would be fatal. But there was far more to Inru's attack than that. The moment Suimai crashed into the ground, the surrounding darkwood trees and even the earth beneath him were turned to mere pulp. You're kidding. Hatsumi could hardly believe what she'd just seen. How could the boy who'd always saved her without fail be so easily defeated? Obstinately refusing to give in to despair, she stared hard into the cloud of dust and dirt that had been kicked up by the impact where he landed. But even when it settled, there was only destruction to be seen. Yakagi. Don't scream like that. I'm alive. Huh? In response to her aggrieved cry, she heard an unexpected voice coming from an unexpected direction. When she turned towards it, standing there holding his stomach and leaning forward a bit, was Suimai. It looked like he was using magic to heal himself. Sweat was pouring from his brow, and a pale green light was coming out of the hand he had placed over his abdomen. Humph. I thought I managed to get you with that one though, remarked Inru. As expected, you can use the draconic eye, huh? Replied Suimai. As expected should be my line. Knowing that, you moved around to try and escape my sight. Though, isn't it a little careless for you to stop to heal your wounds in the middle of battle? Inru boldly offered a word of warning, but Suimai seemed unconcerned. I wonder. I'll let you be the judge of that. NGH? As Suimai sneered at Inru, for some reason, Inru let out a puzzled groan. He staggered, and then shook his head like he was trying to shake something off of it. Hatsumi couldn't tell what had happened. If anything, it looked like he'd been struck with a sudden dizzy spell or case of vertigo. But as she was trying to figure it out, she suddenly realized something. A picture of an eye. On the ground right next to Suimai, different from the one he used when they had defeated Vashta, was a simple drawing in the shape of an eye. But looking carefully, there were copies of the same image all over the ground. It's a Nazar Bonjuk, a charm against the evil eye. Since the draconic eye's origin is based on the concept of the evil eye, this will avert it. I'm not just recklessly fighting here, you know? What a surprise. To think that there is a means of defending against it. Could it be that I've come into an unfavorable matchup? Despite his words, Inru was stifling a giddy laugh. Seeing that he was completely joking around, Suimai scowled at him. Shut up. It's seriously unfair that I can't properly put up a fight unless I take the time to do something like this. Perhaps. But while my foes are rarely able to make up for the difference between us, you were rather quick on the draw with a technique a human should know nothing about. A human from this world, you mean? Aha, I see. You're a denizen of another world. No wonder the magic you use is different from the magic used here. That must be the reason you're so close with the hero, too. It's also why I won't let you take Hatsumi with you. In that case, I understand how you feel. But nevertheless, I have a reason to take her with me no matter what. Inru paused there for a moment and slowly took up his stance again. I won't ask for forgiveness. I'm well aware that I'll be resented for what I plan to do. Whatever. After getting this deep into it, I'm not gonna bitch and moan. That's not gonna stop me from saying whatever the hell else I want, however. Suimai then boldly stuck out his tongue and wiped the fearful sweat from his brow that refused to stop pouring. Seeing him like that, Inru smiled. That's good. I'm all too used to hearing fools trying to argue against their inevitable defeat at this point. Sorry, I'm not the type to play the emotional card. No, but you certainly do have a mouth on you. Shut it. With that, Suimai snapped his fingers. The sound of bursting air marked the opening to the second act of their increasingly ferocious battle like a violent starter pistol. After sealing one of Inru's moves, as expected, Suimai's attacks grew more intense than before. As Suimai had explained, he had now completed his preparations and could finally act as he pleased. He was still racing through the sky while touching down intermittently, but the magic that he was firing off was much stronger, and both his casting speed and frequency had doubled. All of this was about what Inru had expected, so that wasn't what had really caught his attention. As far as he was concerned, Suimai was truly deserving of praise simply for knowing how to fight against a dragon newt. He even seemed more knowledgeable on the matter than Inru himself. Whenever Suimai drew close, he would stay just far away enough to keep out of range of Inru's fists. It would be nearly impossible to gauge that distance just by eye, but Suimai steered perfectly clear of Inru's real threat range. Normally, when Inru swung his fist, the wave of wind that followed would be enough to blow away absolutely everything in its path, just like he'd done with those demons. But Suimai was moving around like he'd seen completely through the attack and knew exactly what to do to avoid it, and then there was matter of the hull wave Inru had unleashed right as they met. Suimai called it a dragon's roar, but he seemed to understand its nature and devastating power perfectly. If he were merely a normal human who knew nothing of dragon newts, he would have been left standing there dumbfounded as he was evaporated. But he'd sensed what Inru was about to do as he was preparing, and played his defensive hand immediately. And that wasn't the only thing he'd seemed to know ahead of time. There was also the dragon's eye. Knowing that Inru held the technique to crush all within his line of sight by just looking at it, Suimai had jumped and flitted about to avoid staying within Inru's field of vision for any extended period of time. Moreover, he'd secretly been preparing a technique to counter it the whole time. All of Inru's powers were deadly, and knowing about them wasn't necessarily enough to do anything about them. They were difficult to grasp in the heat of the moment, and even more difficult to counter. The average person, even knowing what was coming, still would have been laid waste by his power. But not Suimai. He'd gotten through every single one, and was still continuing to put up a fight. Hair. Unconsciously, laughter began to seep from Inru's lips. Before him was a man who was using magic non-stop. All Suimai had to do was tap the ground. Magic circles different from the ones already on the ground would appear behind him. The magic circles that were appearing continuously seemed to be substitutes for chanting. Each circle fired off a spell of its own. The attributes they used varied, and a completely unknown type of attack filled Inru's field of vision to capacity as it came rushing in at him. Now, just like when he'd arrived, his expectations were all being betrayed one after the other. Suimai's casting speed and output were good, but Inru was unable to get his head around how he was doing it so incessantly. Inru knew that there were ways to improve casting speed, so he wasn't particularly surprised that Suimai could cast spells faster than the average mage. What baffled him was that Suimai didn't even seem to be taking a breath between them as he chanted. When magic was used consecutively, mana was expelled from the caster's body. Mana being expelled in such a way would also increase body heat. The body naturally confused this with physical exertion, and would leave a caster short of breath. Normally, because of the length of time it took to chant spells, most mages would never find themselves in such a state. But everyone knew that a mage should have to take a breather after casting too many spells consecutively. But not Swimai. Despite the container of his soul being nothing more than a frail human body, Inru couldn't even hear the sound of Swimai inhaling and exhaling as he continued to chant. All he could see once in a while was a pure white vapor made of mana being expelled from his mouth. He was guessing that there was likely some sort of strange organ inside that human body of his responsible for all this. Swimai's consecutive use of magic was a real threat, but in a sense, his rapid-fire attack was also a form of defense. From the hail of fire, lightning, and light magic he was sending out, it looked like he was on the offensive. But his incessant attacks could also be interpreted as a means of keeping Inru restrained. That would explain why Swimai hadn't yet fired off any particularly powerful spells in an attempt to deal the final blow. If you aren't going to dig in, then I'll be the one to make a move. With that, Inru stomped on the ground. It was like an explosion occurred. The surface of the ground split and sent large lumps of earth flying. But that was all a precursor for darting forward. Inru slipped through Swimai's incoming spells and arrived right in front of him. Inru could see him gulp as he stood there trembling. "Damn it, you moved too fast." Swimai Yakagi let out a shriek of complaint on the spur of the moment. As expected, he was quite flustered. Perhaps due to some bad experience in the past, he was deeply afraid of Inru, no, of dragons. However, that was none of Inru's concern. Aiming for Swimai's lower jaw, he unleashed a kick. To evade the attack coming up from below, Swimai dove to the side. Just as Inru thought that he'd simply thrown himself to the ground, his powers of flight kicked in. Pulled by an invisible force, his body took an unnatural path through the air, and Inru chased after him with a backhanded fist. Swimai had anticipated such a serious blow from the wave of power he felt coming for him, but he couldn't stop it. It struck him in the leg, and when it did, Inru could hear the unmistakable sound of bones breaking. But the immediate moment after Swimai made an anguished expression, a green circle with letters and numbers inscribed within it took shape around his broken leg. It was recovery magic. Every time he was dealt a serious wound, he'd use it to heal himself. As such, it was like Swimai and Inru had come to a stalemate of sorts. Neither could really get an attack in on the other. As that self-deprecating thought passed through Inru's head, a fire spell came charging at him, mere desperation. He scoffed. "Just take it," Swimai shouted. Swimai sounded like he'd meant for this attack to finish Inru off, but that wasn't quite how it panned out. The large fire spell that came sweeping at Inru was just a smokescreen. A cover. For just an inch in front of Inru's head, a tiny magic circle took shape. TCH. It was too close. The moment Inru's mind told him that he wouldn't get off lightly if he were hit by that, his body reflexively took evasive action. However, the moment he distanced himself from the first tiny magic circle, another took shape. And just like that, one after one, they chased after him. No matter how fast he moved, how many times he changed directions, whether he took to the skies or not, the tiny magic circles formed a line that chased right after him. Inru thought they looked like some out-of-place child's toy as they formed an accordion-like shape in the air, but it was then that they finally bared their magical fangs. Chain explosion. When Swimai uttered the keywords, consecutive explosions erupted. In the blink of an eye, they caught up to Inru's face. Gah, ah. Inru took evasive action, but he was too close to avoid the shockwave. Its power was on the same level as a strike from Gilbert's superhuman strength. He couldn't take it unfazed, and the force of the blow kicked his head back. But Inru wasn't about to let that stop him. After lightly shaking his head, however, he could see an ultramarine light coming down from the starry night sky. Did he set this attack up beforehand? The moment Inru sensed impending crisis, Swimai began chanting. Illustra Carmen ad operationem simplicem. Armat ad centum et passive deducit, invocator orgoides. Strategic bombing. Illustrious spell and simplified operation. Arm from 1 to 100 and deploy randomly, invoke orgoides. Strategic bombing. With that, a hail of light fell from the sky. The magic lights raining down reminded Inru of the falling stars he'd seen in the Empire, but this wasn't quite the same spell. Having lost his chance to evade, Inru overflowed his entire body with mana and took a defensive stance. The spell wouldn't last long, but this isn't the end of it. With those words, Suimai began preparing his next act. Before Inru